I kind of wanted to dive off into the Sermon on the Mount a little bit this evening. When I talk to people about God and about the Bible, and people are always saying to me, well, I want to read the Bible through, or I want to know what to read. And anybody that asks me that, I always tell them, I say, start with the Sermon on the Mount. And the reason is because a lot of Scripture is kind of written for us, but not really to us, if that makes sense. A lot of it's written to the Jews who were still trying to, be Jews instead of be Christians, or was written to people or things that, although we glean from it, it really wasn't something that was necessarily written specifically to you and I. But sometimes I read the Sermon on the Mount and I picture Jesus standing there and delivering this message to this crowd, this multitude. And there's a debate about whether this was all one sermon or whether it was several different sermons that were placed together. I often think that if Jesus was here today and was standing preaching to us, he would tell us a lot of the same things that he told them on the Sermon on the Mount. So I always think that maybe it has a lot of relevance to our lives today, to how God expects us to maybe see the world a little bit through his eyes and not our own. Some people read the Sermon on the Mount and say, well, it's just too much. There's no way you can do it. It's too much of an ideal. It's like this perfection that Jesus held up and like we can't do it. But I don't think that's true. I don't think Jesus would tell us something that we couldn't do. I often think of the crowd. Who was there to hear that? There were people who were seeking Jesus, seeking some knowledge, the truth. I believe there were seekers there, people who were genuine in their heart. I believe there were people there who were just there because they wanted to see the show, wanted to see what Jesus could do. Miracles were already happening by now. Things were already taking place. Some people just wanted to maybe see what was going to happen, maybe to get something from Jesus, right? Get a miracle or get something from him. And then I also think there were the skeptics, right? The ones in the crowd, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Jews, the ones who were wanting to catch him in something. It's pretty nice when I preach because I don't have a lot of skeptics, maybe a few, but not like Jesus did, right? I know there's not people sitting out there that are ready to pounce at everything I say or ready to grill me, which would be all right. I'm all right with that. But I know that's not really my audience. But Jesus always had those people, didn't he? The ones that were there ready to criticize, ready to find fault, ready to hold something against him. And yet Jesus stood up and did what Jesus did. Spoke the gospel, right? Spoke the truth. In Matthew, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, he says, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them be like the foolish man who built his house on the sand. Jesus, at the end of this great sermon, he says, these are more than just things I'm saying. These are things to build your faith on, build your life on, build your house on. So I think when we read them, it should affect us that way. It should be something that we hang on. We think, well, how does this apply to me? What does it mean to me? The rain fell, the floods came, the winds blew and slammed against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. And when Jesus finished these words, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority and not as their scribes. Well, that's how it ends. How does it begin? Right? It begins the Beatitudes. I often read these and I think, it's interesting, isn't it? Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God. That's people who were, there's a word for it in the Bible. There's a Hebrew word. It's called anoin. And it's really the word that the Greek relates to. And the word means those left behind. And it really applies to Babylonian captivity. When the Babylonians came and they captured Jerusalem, and they finally sieged it, and they took it over. And they took all these people who were wise and smart and had money, and they took them back to Babylon to make them Babylonians. That's where you get the book of Daniel. Daniel, right, Mishnah, or if you want to know their Babylonian names, right? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Belshazzar. Took them back to Babylon, gave them Babylonian names. He wanted to make Babylon greater. So they took these great minds, they tried to assimilate them into Babylonian culture. But all the poor and the sick and the ones they didn't want, they left them in Jerusalem. You know, if you read the Lamentations, or we used to say Lamentations of Jeremiah, Jeremiah is writing from this grotto in Jerusalem after the destruction of Jerusalem. He's lamenting over Jerusalem. He's in the ruins, in what's left. And there was a lot of people left. And those were the Anawim, the ones left behind. You know, when I was a kid, I was terrible at sports. Those of you that know me know that. And I was always the last to get picked. I always hated it when they picked teams when I was a kid, because I was always last, always, you know. And if it was an odd number, I was the guy who got to sit on the bench, right? Because I was the end, you know. When there was nobody left, pick Rex, right? And that's what the Anawim is. They're the ones that were left, the ones nobody wanted, nobody desired, the poor in spirit. You know, if you read on through this, he says, Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the gentle, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. Blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets that were before you. You know, at different times in my life, I've been a lot of these people. I've been the one who mourned. When I was a kid and young, my dad drank a lot. My parents always fought. It always seems like I was the one in the middle. I always wanted to make peace with them. And when I would read this as just a really young child, I always thought I was the peacemaker. I always thought blessed is the peacemaker. That's what I always considered. I always thought that's what I was. I wasn't very good at it, but I always tried, you know. And the funny thing about the Beatitudes is that it's not something you attain, you know. You don't try to mourn so that you'll have a blessing, or you don't try to be a peacemaker so you'll have a blessing, or you don't try to be poor in spirit so that you'll have a blessing. The amazing things about what Jesus is telling these people in this crowd, this audience, and all of us, is he says at different times in your life, you're going to be one of these people. Whether you want to be or not, you're going to be one of these people. At some point in your life, you're going to mourn. At some point in your life, you're probably going to be a peacemaker. And sometimes in your life, you're going to be left behind. At some point in your life, somebody's going to say something against you because of Jesus. Somebody's going to accuse you. This isn't something you attain to get the blessing. Jesus is saying, I'm blessing you where you're at. I'm blessing you in the state that you're in. And sometimes we don't feel real blessed in the state we're in, do we? Sometimes when we're persecuted, we feel persecuted. And when we mourn, we're sad and we feel grief and we feel pain. And when we're left behind, we feel that, don't we? We feel that being deserted. We feel lonely. We feel unwanted. All of us at some point in our life will be one of these things, and Jesus knew that. And Jesus knew as he preached this, there were people in that crowd who at that time in their life, they were those people. And Jesus said, God will bless you where you are. And I think that's something we miss in the Beatitudes. When I was a kid, I always thought, boy, if I could be a really good peacemaker, then I would get this blessing. And what I failed to understand is that what God was saying, what Christ was saying, is that if you're a peacemaker, you have this blessing. This blessing is yours, and nobody can take it away from you because God sees you, God hears you, God knows you. God puts your tears in his bottle, as the psalmist said, and God will bless you where you're at. And that's such an amazing thought because sometimes that's what we need, and that's what Jesus was saying. I want to bless you where you are. And when you're in a different place, I'm going to bless you there too. Because that's what it means to be blessed by God. God doesn't just bless you and then not bless you. God blesses you all the time. Paul says, in all things I rejoice, right? I rejoice in all things. Why? Because God always has a blessing in those things. Romans 8 says all things work together for good to those who love the Lord and are called according to his purpose. And even in my trials, even in the things that don't go good, I can hang upon that thought, hang upon that idea that all things work together for good and that there's going to be a blessing in my life, that God's going to bless me wherever I am. And that's just an amazing thought to me, what Jesus was trying to tell them, because here you got these people, these Galileans who are poor, who are looked down upon, who are not on the top of the game. And you know, they don't feel blessed. They feel like God's abandoned them. They feel like God's left them. And they're told that, right, by the people around them, the Jews. Oh, you're just Galileans, right? You're uneducated. Isn't that what they told Jesus' apostles? You're uneducated, right? God somehow is not looking down upon you with favor, because that's what the Jews thought. They thought if you were poor, they thought if you were lame, they thought if you were blind, they thought if you were not wealthy, that God was somehow punishing you for your life, punishing you from some sin. Well, they asked the man that was born blind from birth, and what did they say? Who sinned, this man or his parents, right? You know, somehow God was looking unfavorably upon you, and Jesus says no. God's blessing you where you're at. He didn't take your blessing away from you. He's blessing you in the place that you are. And that's just a big idea, and it's comforting to me, isn't it? Comforting to think that God cares about us even at times when maybe we think that he doesn't care for us, right? Maybe we think that we're not that important. And yet God says, I know you, I see you, I care for you, and I'm blessing you where you're at. Hard to wrap our head around that sometimes. There's been times in my life I didn't feel real blessed, I'll be honest. Times in my life I kind of had to look for it a little bit, but it was always there. It's just in my pain and my suffering and my anguish and my grief, I failed to see it. But the blessings were there. I just needed to look. He goes on to say, he says, you're the salt of the earth. Salt and light. Those are two things that Jesus says we are. We're supposed to be, right? And you know, those things they make a difference, don't they? Boy, if you ever got too much salt in something, it's bad. But a little bit of salt, pretty good. Right? You know, light is amazing, isn't it? When my stepfather, I've said this before, but I was thinking it's amazing. My stepfather was in World War II. He was on a tanker in the Pacific Theater, and they wouldn't even let him smoke a cigarette on deck at night because they could see the glow of that cigarette for several miles at night. And it was a court-martial offense if you smoked a cigarette at night on deck because they could see that light. We don't measure darkness, do we? You know, there's things in life we say, we think, boy, it's sure cold. There's no measurement for cold, right? We only measure heat. We say, boy, it's sure dark. But there's no measurement for dark. There's only a measurement for light, right? Darkness is what? Absence of light. Cold is the absence of heat. You know, when Jesus says this, he was telling us that these things are things that are measurable. Things that change things, like we should change things. They're things that you know if they're missing. You know if they're not there. You know, has the power ever gone off and you look downtown and it's dark? Seems strange, doesn't it? No light. You missed the light. Jesus says you're the salt of the earth. But if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? Once you've lost it, once you've lose your flavor, can it come back? It's not good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on the lampstand. And it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. You know, Jesus says that we should be seen by men, that we should make a difference in the world. Sometimes I feel insignificant, unimportant. Do you ever feel that way? I do. I look at my life sometimes and I think, you're insignificant, you know? You can't really change things. You can't change the world. I can't change politics. Can't change world policy, right? You know, it's funny, we talk a lot about it, but the truth is, at the end of the day, there's not much you or I can do about it. They're not going to call us up and ask us, right? You know, we're pretty good, got our hands tied, don't we? But I think what Jesus was trying to tell me, and what he's trying to tell you, is that we can change our world. You know, I can't change the world. I maybe can't even change all of Henrietta. I know I can't. I maybe can't even change 50 people in Henrietta. But I can change the people that I'm close to. I can change my family. I can change the people I love. To them, I can make a difference, right? I can choose to make a difference in their lives. I can choose to stand up for what I believe in, for what's right. I can choose to pray with them. I can choose to show them Jesus. I can choose to be that kind of person. And the truth, when I do that, is I become maybe not salt and light to the world, maybe not salt and light to all of Henrietta, but I can become salt and light to the people that I know, to the people in my circle. And maybe that's what God wants us to be. You know, if you could change a child, if you could influence a child or influence an adult, if you can influence anyone for Jesus, then you've made a difference. Maybe that one person will make a difference. We're all here tonight, every one of us, because of a person. Every one of us. Because of somebody. I don't know who that person was in your life. I don't know who that influence was. But I can guarantee you, every one of you here tonight is here because somebody stood up for Christ. Somebody asked you. Somebody prodded you. Somebody hauled you here when you were a child. Somebody changed your life. A person. And if they can do that, then we can be the person that changes somebody else's life. You know, the funny thing about it, if you read Romans says, offer your spiritual sacrifice to God. It's your reasonable service, right? You know, sometimes we look at life, we look at faith, we look at God, and we think, man, I need to change the world. I need to change everything. But God says, you know, sometimes you just need to be reasonable service. Change your world. Change your life. Change your influence. Save one. You know, there's a story of a little girl, and I love this story, and I've told it before, but the little girl where all the starfish washed up on the ocean, and they were all laying there, and thousands of them, and the little girl was picking them up and throwing them in the ocean, and her dad says, what are you doing? He says, there's thousands of these starfish out here. You can't make a difference. And the little girl picked one up and threw it in the ocean, and she said, I can save this one. You know, that story's always stuck with me. You know, I can't save the whole world. I know it. I know I can't even save all of Henrietta. Maybe I can save one, right? And maybe one's all God's asking me to save. I don't know. A lot here, isn't there? I'm going to continue with this next Sunday night. There's a lot here, and I'm not trying to get real deep into this like I would in class. Just trying to hit the top. But I hope it makes you look at it a little bit. And maybe at night when you lay down and close your eyes, maybe you can hear Jesus preaching these words to you, because I think he would. You're blessed and you're important. Maybe that's the two things you need to get out of this one tonight. Jesus is looking at you and he's saying, I'm blessing you and you're important. And don't ever forget that. If there's any way we can help you tonight, if you need the prayers of this church, would you let it be known as we stand and sing?